family is safe and protected and we're uplifted and can still make time for date night. Be oftentimes after school with him, helping with his antiques and watching.
For years, Meghan Markle appeared determined to build a future far beyond palace walls. But as Hollywood opportunities allegedly began thinning and old alliances became quieter, whispers emerged of something few expected: a carefully controlled plan that could bring Meghan back toward Britain without ever admitting defeat. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Meghan had spent years creating distance from the institution that once defined nearly every part of her public life. Britain had represented restriction, protocol, scrutiny, and a system she believed left little room for independence. America, by contrast, had seemed to offer something intoxicating: freedom. Freedom to speak. Freedom to create. Freedom to decide which doors opened and which remained firmly closed. In the beginning, that promise appeared enormous. Major deals, influential connections, global attention, and the sense that Meghan and Harry could build an empire entirely outside royal control made their new chapter feel almost unstoppable. But momentum is fragile. Behind the confidence, a quieter pressure allegedly began to grow. Projects were not moving with the speed once imagined. Certain relationships appeared less dependable. Powerful people who had once seemed eager to stand beside the Sussexes were supposedly becoming more careful, more distant, more selective. None of this meant collapse. But it created something almost as dangerous: uncertainty. And for Meghan, the threat was never just about money. The deeper danger was relevance. Influence, control. She had fought to tell her own story rather than allow the palace or the press to tell it for her. Yet if public interest began cooling, that control could disappear in a different way. The world would not necessarily turn against her. It could simply begin looking somewhere else. That possibility allegedly changed the tone of private conversations. Britain, once discussed mainly through the language of pain and conflict, began appearing in a different context. Royal events were no longer merely reminders of what had been left behind. Reconciliation was no longer treated as an impossible word. Those around the couple supposedly noticed the shift. Subtle, careful, never explicit, but difficult to miss. Because one truth had become harder to escape. However complicated Meghan's relationship with the monarchy remained, the royal connection still carried extraordinary global power. Every palace development, every major ceremony, every family tension could pull her name back into headlines instantly. And that created a brutal paradox. Moving closer to Britain could be interpreted as surrender. Staying completely away, however, risked allowing the monarchy to evolve without her until the absence itself became permanent. So the alleged idea taking shape was not about asking for forgiveness. It was about finding a route back without appearing to retreat. And according to the whispers now gathering around the Sussex story, this was not an impulsive change of heart. It began when Meghan allegedly realized that Hollywood's silence could become far more dangerous than palace hostility. The biggest warning did not come through a public humiliation or dramatic cancellation. It came through something colder: fewer calls, slower conversations, quieter invitations, and the terrifying possibility that Hollywood had begun viewing Meghan not as an unstoppable global figure, but as a brand carrying more controversy than certainty. Hollywood thrives on momentum. Attention matters, but attention alone is never enough. Relationships must remain warm. Projects must keep moving. And powerful people must believe that attaching themselves to a name will create excitement rather than complications. When Meghan and Harry first stepped away from royal duties, the fascination surrounding them was enormous. Every interview, announcement, appearance, and whispered plan carried the weight of a major event. They were not simply former royals building a new life. They were the couple who had walked away from one of the most famous institutions in the world. But shock has an expiration date. Once the drama of departure became familiar, the challenge changed. The Sussexes had to prove they could keep commanding attention without constantly returning to the conflict that had made their story so explosive in the first place. That was where the atmosphere allegedly began shifting. Some entertainment figures supposedly became more cautious, aware that even an ordinary collaboration could quickly be pulled into questions about Harry, Meghan, William, Catherine, or another chapter of palace tension. For Meghan, that possibility carried a bitter irony. She had left behind one rigid hierarchy in search of creative independence, only to discover that Hollywood had its own invisible rules, its own gatekeepers, and its own unforgiving calculations. And slowly, Britain may have started looking different. Not as a home waiting for her return, not yet, but as the source of the one story that still seemed capable of pulling the entire world back toward her name. Meanwhile, William and Catherine continued moving deeper into the center of royal life, becoming more important to the monarchy's future with every passing year. If their influence grew while the Sussex narrative weakened, Meghan risked being pushed further outside a story she had once helped dominate. Harry allegedly recoiled at that logic. Britain was not merely a publicity opportunity to him. It carried wounds, family fractures, and memories that had never fully healed. The idea that their future might somehow depend on reconnecting with royal life threatened to reopen everything they had escaped. But Meghan's supposed answer was more precise than a return. No surrender. No restoration of the old arrangement. Instead, selective proximity, close enough to the monarchy to revive interest, but distant enough to protect independence. That distinction would become crucial, because Meghan's supposed plan was never to walk back through the palace gates, asking for her old place. It was to create an entirely new position, just close enough to the crown to matter again. Meghan could build companies, produce programs, launch brands, and surround herself with powerful names, but there was one asset Hollywood could never manufacture: the mystery of royalty. And as the Sussexes allegedly discovered, walking away from the monarchy had not destroyed that connection. It had made controlling it far more complicated. Royalty carries a kind of fascination that ordinary celebrity cannot easily reproduce. It is built from ceremony, inheritance, hierarchy, family loyalty, old wounds, and traditions that stretch far beyond any single personality. Every major royal gathering carries layers of meaning. Every absence can become a story. Every appearance can trigger speculation. And Meghan allegedly began confronting an uncomfortable truth: the institution she had left behind could still command worldwide attention without needing her involvement at all. That realization may have been especially difficult because the Sussexes had once dominated the global conversation. But major royal moments could shift attention instantly. A ceremony, a family milestone, or a significant appearance by William and Catherine could push independent Sussex projects to the edges of the news cycle. The monarchy did not have to compete directly. Its history did the work for it. For Meghan, the emotional contradiction was sharp. She wanted to prove that her future did not depend on palace approval. Yet royal developments continued pulling her name back into public discussion. Distance had given her independence, but it had not severed the connection. In some ways, it had made that connection even more valuable. Then came the children. Archie and Lilibet were not simply part of Meghan and Harry's private life. They represented a permanent family link to Britain and to a history neither parent could erase. And that allegedly raised a more complicated question. What would happen as they grew older? Would they understand the traditions connected to their family? Would they have meaningful relationships with relatives whose own children were becoming increasingly central to the monarchy. For Harry, that question cut deeper. His anger toward palace structures could exist alongside something more private: nostalgia, loyalty, and the fear that his children might someday ask why an entire part of their heritage had been kept at a distance. Meghan allegedly saw the opening, not through a return to royal duty, but through family milestones, charitable causes, carefully chosen appearances, and visits controlled enough to preserve independence while restoring proximity. The strategy was beginning to reveal itself, and that is where the hidden strategy allegedly takes shape, because Meghan's route back to Britain was never supposed to resemble reconciliation in the traditional sense. The alleged plan was audacious precisely because it avoided the one thing Meghan could never accept: appearing to crawl back. Instead of returning as a working royal, insiders imagined a far subtler strategy: short visits, carefully chosen causes, controlled appearances, family symbolism, and just enough royal proximity to restore global fascination. The first move would not be dramatic. That was the point. No permanent relocation. No public declaration that the Sussex chapter in California had failed. Instead, Meghan would allegedly begin with carefully limited visits connected to causes she could defend on her own terms: charity work, women's advocacy, youth initiatives, or private family matters. Each appearance would be short enough to avoid looking like a return to royal duty, yet significant enough to pull Britain back into the Sussex story. The next layer was even more calculated. Meghan would supposedly try to separate her presence in Britain from direct palace permission wherever possible. She would arrive not as a working duchess asking to be restored, but as an independent public figure with her own projects, her own platform, and her own reasons for being there. That distinction could change everything. Then came the royal contact. Not full reconciliation, not immediate forgiveness. Instead, selective moments involving King Charles, family milestones, or the children. Archie and Lilibet could become the emotional key, because their connection to royal history cannot simply disappear. Any suggestion that they were being kept permanently outside that world could create uncomfortable questions for both sides, and Meghan's alleged strategy depended on avoiding overexposure. Brief appearances could create enormous headlines precisely because they were rare. She could leave before palace officials regained control of the narrative, preserving the mystery while slowly rebuilding familiarity with the British public. The language would also change. Less open confrontation. Fewer explosive accusations. More carefully measured references to family, healing, and unfinished relationships. But none of it could work without Harry. His presence transformed the meaning of every visit. Meghan alone could be treated as a celebrity returning to Britain. Meghan beside Harry became something far more powerful, the wife of the king's son, standing again inside the orbit of the monarchy. That was the brilliance and the weakness of the alleged plan. California could remain home while Britain became an occasional stage whenever attention elsewhere weakened. Yet the strategy depended on the palace cooperating just enough to make that proximity matter. And William, more than anyone, might recognize the danger, because while Meghan may have imagined a return without surrender, the palace had already learned the cost of ambiguity, and one senior royal was allegedly determined never to allow the Sussexes to occupy two worlds again. If Meghan's strategy depended on royal proximity without royal obedience, then Prince William represented its greatest obstacle. He had allegedly watched years of private grievances become public battles, and the possibility of reopening palace doors without strict boundaries was not reconciliation to him, it was an invitation to repeat history. For William, the issue was bigger than personal resentment. It was structure. The monarchy survives on clear roles, visible duty, and an understanding of who represents the institution and who does not. Any arrangement that allowed Harry and Meghan to step close to royal life when convenient, while remaining free from its obligations, could blur those lines all over again. That uncertainty was exactly what William allegedly feared. A carefully chosen appearance beside the family could instantly raise questions. Were the Sussexes back inside the fold? Were they being restored gradually? Did a private meeting signal political reconciliation? Every gesture could be interpreted as something larger, and William supposedly believed the monarchy could not afford another period in which personal relationships and official status became impossible to separate. Catherine's position was quieter, but no less complicated. She had endured years of headlines, accusations, comparisons, and speculation surrounding her relationship with Meghan. Even without taking a confrontational role, the emotional damage allegedly remained. Reopening the door could mean reopening wounds everyone had spent years trying to contain. Meghan, meanwhile, would have understood the difference between Charles and William immediately. Charles could still be approached as a father, a grandfather, a man with an emotional reason to seek peace. William was different. He represented the future crown. What Charles might consider in the name of family healing, William could view as a dangerous precedent he would one day inherit. Palace advisors allegedly saw the same risk. Any major Meghan appearance in Britain could become the story, overwhelming the event itself, and instantly reviving speculation about feuds, forgiveness, betrayal, and hidden negotiations. Then came the children, making every boundary harder. Family members might genuinely want relationships with Archie and Lilibet, while still rejecting any broader restoration of Meghan's royal visibility. But could those two things really be separated? Could private family access remain private once the world began watching again? That question threatened to become the next battlefield. And caught directly between Meghan's need for a new opening and William's determination to close every loophole was the one person whose choice could either revive the plan or destroy it completely. For Harry, the question was no longer simply whether he missed Britain. It was whether returning could heal anything without reopening everything. Meghan allegedly needed him to make the strategy possible, while the family he left behind demanded something far harder than a visit: clarity about where his loyalty truly belonged. That was the impossible weight Harry carried. He was a husband, a father, a son, a brother, and still, whether he liked it or not, a prince shaped by the institution he had spent years trying to escape. Britain held memories of duty, family, grief, and Diana. California represented the life he chose with Meghan. Neither world was emotionally simple anymore. For Meghan, Harry's identity remained essential. Without him, any return to Britain risked looking like little more than a celebrity appearance. With him, everything changed. He was the king's son. His presence gave every visit emotional gravity, royal significance, and the kind of global attention no carefully planned campaign could manufacture on its own. But that same power frightened Harry. Renewed contact could pull him straight back into the machinery he had rejected. The hierarchy, the scrutiny, the endless interpretation of every word and gesture. Even a quiet meeting with Charles could become front-page proof of reconciliation before anyone involved was ready to call it that. And Charles allegedly faced his own dilemma. A father might want his son closer. A king could not ignore what that reunion might mean for the institution. Affection and responsibility were colliding, and Harry knew that every private conversation risked becoming a public symbol. Then there was William. If Harry rejected Meghan's alleged strategy completely, he risked leaving his wife and children increasingly disconnected from Britain. Yet if he embraced it, he could destroy whatever fragile trust might still survive between the brothers. The children made the question even harder. Harry could resent the system and still wonder whether Archie and Lilibet should inherit that resentment. Would they one day ask why their connection to Britain, their grandfather, and their wider family had been shaped by conflicts that began before they were old enough to understand them? And here the difference between Harry and Meghan allegedly became crucial. Meghan could view Britain as a strategic opening. Harry could never see it only that way. For him, every return carried emotional history. If their professional future became less certain, that difference might stop being manageable. Because beneath Harry's family dilemma lies an even colder question. What happens if the California dream no longer provides enough security to make permanent separation from Britain feel sustainable? Royal exile was supposed to produce freedom, but freedom becomes frightening when every new project must succeed, every partnership must perform, and every headline becomes part of the business model. Behind Meghan's alleged UK strategy sits a deeper anxiety. What happens when independence itself becomes a pressure cage? Outside royal life, the rules were different. Meghan and Harry had greater control over what they said, what they created, and which opportunities they pursued. But independence came with a harder demand. They had to keep proving their value. Royal status once carried built-in visibility. Celebrity life did not. Every production, partnership, appearance, book, and brand had to justify itself in a marketplace where attention could disappear as quickly as it arrived. The pressure in this telling was not about sudden financial ruin. It was about maintaining an expensive, high-profile operation indefinitely while ensuring the Sussex name remained commercially powerful. That meant reputation and income could no longer be separated. If public interest weakened, business opportunities could weaken with it. For Meghan, that raised an unsettling fear. What if everything she built outside the palace remained permanently overshadowed by the story of why she left it? She had wanted a future defined by achievement, not royal conflict. Yet the monarchy still generated the kind of attention independent projects struggled to match. That made Britain both dangerous and irresistible. The British press could be brutal. Palace relationships remained fractured. But a single high-profile return could dominate international coverage and potentially reignite commercial curiosity without restoring any official royal role. And that possibility created a darker tension. What if the palace understood exactly how valuable that proximity could be? William and his advisors might decide that denying the Sussexes visible royal access was not merely about boundaries. It could also prevent them from benefiting from an association they no longer served. For Harry, that idea could become deeply uncomfortable. His father, brother, and children's family connections were personal. If those relationships began to feel like pieces of a commercial survival strategy, resentment could grow quickly. That did not mean Meghan and Harry were breaking apart. But it suggested a difference in meaning. They had left Britain together. Now Meghan might see returning as strategic positioning, while Harry could experience the same decision as an emotional reckoning. And beneath both perspectives waited the most difficult question of all. If Hollywood no longer offered the future Meghan imagined, and the palace refused to restore the influence she once held, then who was she supposed to become next? And as those pressures collide, Meghan's alleged strategy begins facing its greatest test. Britain may still be available as a stage, but the role waiting for her there may be nothing like the one she left behind. The most brutal part of returning is discovering that the place you left did not remain frozen in your absence. New loyalties have hardened, old wounds have become history, and the royal machine has continued moving forward. Meghan may return to Britain, but she cannot return to the Britain she remembers. The monarchy she stepped away from has changed. Roles have shifted. Expectations have narrowed. William and Catherine have moved deeper into the center of royal life, carrying more of the weight attached to the future of the crown. Around them, the institution has continued filling space, adapting, and presenting a version of itself that no longer appears to be waiting for Harry and Meghan to come back. That may be the hardest reality of all. Other royals have taken on responsibilities, occupied public attention, and strengthened the sense that there is no empty position being preserved for the Sussexes. If Meghan returned now, she would not return with the same household, influence, or official standing she once held. The structure around her would be different, and so would the balance of power. The public reaction would be equally unpredictable. Curiosity would almost certainly be intense. Headlines would explode. Every gesture would be dissected. But attention is not acceptance, and Meghan would know the difference. Still, she might allegedly view even hostility as evidence of something useful, relevance. If Britain reacted strongly, then Britain still cared. Criticism could be painful, but indifference would be worse, and that is where the strategy becomes emotionally brutal. Meghan may need the royal connection most at the exact moment the monarchy has proved it can function without her. That imbalance would be difficult to ignore. Charles might still offer warmth in private, especially where Harry and the children are concerned, but private family contact is not the same as public restoration. For Meghan, that could be too little to make a return strategically meaningful. For William, it could already feel like too much. Any compromise would therefore carry danger. A quiet reunion could create public expectations. A larger appearance could reignite old tensions. Refusing contact could deepen the family divide. Accepting it could blur the boundaries the palace has spent years reinforcing. So the choice becomes stark: return under different terms, retreat and accept permanent distance, or attempt to create a completely new relationship with the crown that has never existed before. And so the Sussex story arrives at a crossroads more dangerous than the one that carried them away from Britain. Because this time, there may be no perfect escape route in either direction. Meghan once faced a choice between royal duty and personal freedom. Now the dilemma may be reversed. Hollywood independence allegedly feels less certain, Britain remains emotionally dangerous, and the palace is stronger in its boundaries. Her final gamble is not simply whether to return, but whether she can return without losing herself. By now, the alleged strategy is clear. Meghan would not seek reinstatement. She would seek presence. Carefully timed visits. Independent causes. Family connections. Just enough proximity to remind the world that her story is still tied to the crown, but never enough to place her fully back under palace control. Yet that balance is almost impossibly fragile. Charles could remain the emotional opening, the father and grandfather who may still believe private reconciliation is worth pursuing. William, however, represents something colder, the institutional boundary. Harry stands painfully between them, carrying loyalty in both directions while trying to protect the family he built. And Meghan remains the strategist, attempting to preserve the independence she fought for without becoming permanently irrelevant to the royal world she left behind. One successful visit could transform everything. A carefully handled return could dominate global headlines, test British public feeling, and create the impression that a new chapter was beginning. But one mistake could be devastating. A badly judged appearance, an unexpected controversy, or even a single misunderstood gesture could revive every old accusation and make future reconciliation harder than before. And Hollywood uncertainty would not automatically force Meghan back toward royalty. It could push her somewhere else entirely. She may have to reinvent herself beyond both worlds, to become something neither palace tradition nor celebrity expectation had prepared her to be. For Harry, the stakes are even more personal. Archie and Lilibet may someday decide for themselves what Britain means to them. Home? Heritage? Family? Or simply the distant setting of a conflict they inherited but never chose? That is why the final question remains unresolved. Does Meghan truly want reconciliation? Or does she want something more difficult? A relationship with Britain that no longer requires permission from the palace. The monarchy may ultimately decide how close she can come. But Meghan may decide whether being close is enough, and the next family milestone, royal gathering, or unexpected British appearance could expose whether this alleged strategy has remained an idea or has already begun. Because if Meghan does step onto British soil again with Harry beside her, the real story will not be that she returned, it will be who opened the door, who refused to move, and what price the Sussexes were willing to pay to stand near the crown once more.